it is an incredible honor to welcome aboard Ambassador Francis Rooney. Francis Rooney was the ambassador to the Holy See from 2005 to 2008 during the Bush administration. And Ambassador Rooney is the author of The Global Vatican, an inside look at the Catholic Church, world politics, and the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. Ambassador Rooney, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Well, thank you for having me on, Chuck.
You know, I really am enjoying this book thoroughly. This is an easy book to read. It is deep and yet very much in the popular genre. I urge people to read it. It gives a great insight not only in terms of the history of the modern history of the Catholic Church, but also the history of diplomacy and the history of some of the philosophies that have made the American Republic what it is. So I congratulate you for writing such an extraordinary book.
Well, I really appreciate that. That was the goal of the book, was to write a book that would be understandable but yet cover the foreign policy issues.
You know, to make it brief, the history of the Catholic Church, I was struck by how Catholic understanding has played such a congruent role with the way we Americans perceive our government, the way of our philosophy of government, and you trace that back to St. Thomas Aquinas and his book, his Theologica, the Summa Theologica. Could you talk a little on that?
Yeah, you know, it's one of the ironies that the Enlightenment philosophers, Rousseau, Montesquieu, John Locke, turn their back, and Voltaire, harshly on the principles of St. Thomas and the principles of the Church, even though they were espousing the same exact thing, which is what I tried to show in some of those parallel quotes in the book. And I think it had to do with their aversion to the monarchies in Europe and the types of government that the Church had been mixed up with in that time, but they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, because the fundamental principles of the Enlightenment are the same that our country was founded on, are the same ones that the Church's diplomacy is based on and was based on then.
You know, one of the particular comments that you make that I found quite revelatory is that it was Aquinas, reflecting Catholic understanding and value going back millennia, who wrote about the just government, the consent of the governed. And this was a concept that was really developed by the American founders when they developed elected government. But yet the idea was that a legitimate government, in order to derive its legitimacy, must reflect the values and the virtues of the people that are being governed. So that's very interesting to me.
That's right. See, everybody speaks of John Locke when they talk about the social contract between the governing and the governed. But it really goes back to Thomas Aquinas and really the Roman Republic, quite frankly. And that's part of Pope Benedict spoke up many times that reason and religion are not enemies, that the Enlightenment did not have to be the enemy of the Church just because it was the enemy of monarchical governments in 18th century Europe. The principles were the same. Religious freedom, from which all other freedoms come, defending human rights and the essential natural rights of man that create human dignity of the person. Those are the same things that are in our preamble to our Constitution.
And the idea of natural rights is also a very Catholic and even a very Roman idea. I think our founding fathers recognized that, maybe they, in the sense that they revered the Roman Republic. In fact, here in Boston, where I am, Harrison Gray Otis used to walk around in a toga. And President George Washington established the Cincinnatus Society based upon the principles of Cincinnatus, who was the Roman general who served in office and then went back to the farm after finishing his service. So you have this idea of limited government, and also the Roman Catholic Church, I think, should be credited with the development of the concept of subsidiarity. Even though the English get credit for that, that has been how the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, I think, has conducted itself around the world, in that the bishops have a great deal of autonomy, and then they, in turn, give priests a great deal of autonomy in their local parishes in terms of how to conduct their affairs, while at the same time being a part of this hierarchy.
You know, it's like that phrase, the simplest solution's usually the best one. get the decision making closest to the people. In the United States, we see that work with school districts. There's nothing better than a school district with an enlightened set of parents who wants the best for their kids of all socio and economic differences.
Well, it's an American ideal that we often believe that the most important government is the local government, and then, as you go up the chain toward the state, toward the federal, they have more national responsibilities that are less directed on in terms of everyday life. I'm also struck that the Catholic Church really could be credited with establishing what we call modern diplomacy. And I mean that in the literal sense. You point out that they established a college of diplomacy and that Catholic bishops were very well schooled, particularly the popes, in the art and science of diplomacy, offering their offices as a neutral arbiter in conflict and offering moral suasion to nations of the world.
Yeah, 700 years before the Peace of Westphalia and the development of the nation state, that was 1648. 700 years before that, 800 years back after Charlemagne, the first emissaries were sent around the world from the Holy See and to the Holy See to conduct basically diplomatic interchange. And that spread to, as the nation states evolved towards the Westphalian concept later, it became more and more organized. And the Holy See has always had one of the largest diplomatic representations in the world. Right now, there are 179 countries with representatives before the Holy See. It's the second largest diplomatic corps after the one for the United States. And even in the 18th century, the Turks and the Chinese wanted to send emissaries to the Holy See because it was such a hotbed of information exchange, but the French talked them out of it, wanting to kind of keep them subservient to the French interest. I put all that in the book.
Right. No, I know. You get into it's a great history of diplomacy, and I think it's not inaccurate to say that the Catholic Church evolved the whole concept of the embassy, of diplomatic immunity, of legations in foreign capitals, and foreign capitals having legations at the Vatican, and this whole idea. Obviously, I suppose concomitant to that is the Catholic idea of sanctuary, where the church itself can become a sanctuary when you have conflicting interests. You've got two princes that are at war with each other. They can go to the church. One of them can go to the church and get sanctuary, and then the priest, and in some cases even the Pope, would then try to negotiate an agreement where they could go back to the status quo ante. So all of these concepts that we now take for granted, I think one could say emanated from Catholicism over the many, many centuries. And of course, the Catholic Church being millennia old, and the papacy itself, the primate, the Pope, is the longest held office in the history of the world. I mean, it predates Christianity. It goes back to the Roman kingdom. I think the first Pope in Rome who handled religious affairs, was actually a contemporary of King Solomon. So, I mean, if you think about the extraordinary length of that office, and you get into, in modern times, the different challenges that office has had, and the threats it's had, and how it has endured through very wise decisions that have, in essence, added to its moral strength and its temporal strength. Now, it's just an extraordinary story.
Well, I appreciate that. When you look at the historically the role of Pius VII when Napoleon was trying to expunge the Holy See from the world and from the world of diplomacy, and then you look at the reunification of Italy in 1870, where Garibaldi was trying to do the same thing. Pius IX and Pius VII maintained that sovereignty that you're talking about. That if they hadn't have done that, then there wouldn't have been a diplomatic force in the Holy See and a neutrality that we could leverage in World War II, or that we could deploy to help fight the Cold War, or that Pope Benedict had deployed in speaking up against radical Islam, and now Pope Francis is deploying now, trying to evangelize Latin America to rise up and seek better governments and freedom.
Which was a major effort on the Catholic Church in the post-war period, And I think that you accurately recount the controversies around Pope Pius XII. And I read a book recently by Jan Pacepa, who was America's highest-ranking Soviet defector, and who was head of intelligence in Romania during the Cold War. And he points out that this attack on Pius XII as being pro-Nazi was a Soviet attack. I mean, it was completely created as disinformation by the Soviet Union. He says he was in some of those meetings himself, and the reason the Soviets did this was because they needed to discredit the moral authority of the Catholic Church. It was a major threat to their hegemony, and they turned out to be right, because look what happened when Pope John Paul II went to Poland and held a mass that was the largest single gathering of human beings in the history of the world. Right after that, you had Solidarity, and what did they do? They sent an assassin. So,
yeah.
They understood the nature of their enemy there.
Yeah, in fact, I put in the book that some of the things from the now declassified Kuklinski documents, the Matrukin, and some of the Matrukin papers, that the KGB had a file on Wojtyla when he became Bishop of Krakow, and they wanted to get him then.
And I think that it's safe to say that John Paul II played a very instrumental role in the collapse of communism. And President Ronald Reagan, whose father was Catholic and who always admired the Catholic Church, he understood that, which was partially why he recognized the Vatican as a sovereign nation. Why did it take, however, so long for the United States to recognize the Vatican and send an ambassador?
Well, that's really one of the points of the book, is to kind of show the evolution of the relationship. Two seemingly very similar principled organizations, sovereigns, were kept apart for many years, part because of the anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States, and certainly I think Boston people know about that. And second, the kind of monarchism tendencies that the Holy See displayed up until recently, that, we fought a war against monarchy, especially right there at Bunker Hill, and so those things kept the United States away. But over time, President Roosevelt realized how important the Holy See's neutrality and sovereignty could be in World War II. President Truman realized that as he tried to bring religious leaders together to fight communism, and only the Catholic Church stood up to do that. The other Protestant denominations didn't. And then, I wrote a little bit about the subtle diplomacy of Norman Cousins with President Kennedy and Khrushchev that led up to the big missile crisis publication in Pravda of the Vatican radio address. So these things have evolved over time, and finally the stars aligned with President Reagan.
Thank you very much. We're joined by Ambassador Francis Rooney, who represented the United States at the Vatican during the Bush administration. What a glorious experience that must have been. What a great honor. Ambassador Rooney, we're talking about bringing things up to the present with regard to the role of the Vatican in international diplomacy and its role in the world. You describe it as a soft power. Obviously, the Vatican doesn't have divisions like Stalin said when he challenged them, and yet they certainly have outlived Stalin. They have moral suasion. They can take a position that impacts people's minds and souls and hearts around the world, and they are looked to by the world as a moral arbiter in conflict and in leadership. Where does the Roman Catholic Church stand today, and the Vatican, in its position diplomatically?
Well, I think that the Holy See's soft power, Chuck, is more important and relevant today than ever. You look at the kind of conflicts we're seeing around the world, many of which have religious and tribal overtones and cultural overtones. You can kill everybody off, but that's about what you're going to have to do to resolve them, because you're not going to find agreement without coming to some kind of understanding of the drivers of these conflicts, the fundamental human motivations, and that's what soft power speaks to.
Now, I'm about a little over halfway through the book, so I haven't yet gotten to the part of the book that deals with your ambassadorship period. I know former Vatican ambassador Ray Flynn personally. He used to have a radio show after mine. And I think his main work in the Vatican was helping with humanitarian relief in Africa and other efforts that the church has been up front on. But could you talk a bit about your tenure at the Vatican during the Bush administration?
Sure, and I'd also like to plug my dear friend, Ambassador Flynn, and Mayor Flynn, too, because he had a much tougher situation than I did, because the Holy See was so at odds with the Clinton administration over population policies. And one of the things he worked on was that population conference in Cairo, where the Holy See actually beat back an effort to put in place some very anti-life policies. You know, George Bush was so philosophically and personally aligned with the principles of the Holy See that it made my time a very productive time. There are many things we could accomplish, but it was also pretty easy to get everybody's attention. Both the president always wanting to know what the Holy See thought about things, and the Holy See wanting to be helpful to exploit this alignment of principles that we both shared. So I worked hard with the Holy See on, like, the Lebanon War in 2006 to unite the Christians, have the Holy See work to unite the Christian coalition in the opposition to Hezbollah. We worked on a lot of programs in Latin America to work with some of the priests and NGOs scattered around Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Cuba, where there are regimes that are hostile to the United States. Those are a couple of the primary areas. We worked hard, with Caritas, which is Catholic Charities in the international sphere, is called Caritas, to work with PEPFAR, the President Bush's emergency plan for AIDS, to try to make sure that the retroviral drugs and things were distributed as efficiently as possible. And Caritas was a huge help in all that. So those were things that were very important. We also continue to expand our human trafficking program. The Holy See mission is one of the world leaders in exposing human trafficking, working with nuns who help the trafficked girls and who to bring visibility to some of these countries who basically tacitly support trafficking.
No, I mean, this is then you were getting up front on the great moral challenges that the world faces today. And I think that regarding the program in Africa to help get anti-AIDS drugs into Africa, even Bush's enemies praise Bush for that. And it's quite heartening to know that you played a role in it through, as a liaison to the Vatican. That's a fantastic effort. And, it sounds to me like the church. Yep, please.
Well, 27% of all AIDS patients are dealt with in a Catholic healthcare institution. So the opportunities for continued leverage of the United States humanitarian mission in the Holy See is huge going forward, too.
And I think that it's safe to say that the Catholic social agencies and humanitarian agencies are par excellence. There's nothing like it in the history of the world. And they do it with very little government assistance. It's just an incredible story that ought to be told, and it's certainly true in the United States and probably around the world as well. To my way of thinking, if this is what the church is focusing on, then that's exactly the right position. And it's such positioning of the church that has, I think, accounted for its incredible survival all these thousands of years. It's survived because it's relevant, because it connects with people and it connects with real issues.
That's right. And here just recently, just as they've been involved in treaty negotiations, you alluded to the safe harbor ever since treaty was.
Okay, we got one more break here, then we'll conclude the interview when we come back. Please stay tuned, and we'll be right back. Thank you very much. And my guest is Ambassador Francis Rooney, U.S. Ambassador to the Vatican during the Bush administration. The book is The Global Vatican, an inside look at the Catholic Church, world politics, and the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. Ambassador Rooney, the great strength of the Church can also be its weakness, which was revealed in the sex abuse scandal that particularly was a big story here in my own hometown of Boston back around 2002, 2003. But the church seems to have weathered it. They seem to have righted the ship of state. Would you say that would be the case?
I would. And, Chuck, you made an important point a while back about the subsidiarity that became an obstacle in the abuse scandal situation, because you've got 4,500 bishops scattered around the world, and some of them dealt with their problems well, and some of them didn't. And what we're seeing is the results of the ones that didn't deal with their problems well. And one of the great leaders in fixing this was Pope Benedict. When he became head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, long before he became Pope, he put in the procedures to make sure that no more cover-ups occurred, no more moving priests from one place to another occurred, and that the civil authorities were brought in. And I think that began the healing process that, as you allude to now, I think we're dealing with some history lessons, but we're not dealing with current problems.
So did the church have to change its methodologies in order to deal with this and to get food, in order to function in society? If this isn't that, I don't know what is. I'm sorry, but I generally consider myself to be a supporter of industry and of technology. I don't like to think of myself as a Luddite, like a lot of these people who are criticizing, the pipeline from Canada. But at the same time, and maybe this is coming from my reading of the
Christians are being persecuted, human rights are being violated, etc. Also, many cases in Africa as well. And I think that the Obama administration had been fairly attenuated and disinterested in leveraging the Holy See for a while. Now he's gone over and made a visit to the Pope. People speculate on who was trying to get the most out of whom in that visit. But the bottom line is, at least he made the visit. That means a lot, just like it meant a lot when Pius VII went to Napoleon's coronation, even though Napoleon tried to manipulate him. And I think that hopefully the president, and certainly I know Secretary Kerry does feel that there's a lot to leverage the Holy See. And that's why he made his own special trip over there earlier in the winter. So I'm encouraged. I'm going to be encouraged that they're going to resume the strong diplomatic relationships that we've had in the past and use the Holy See's voice, especially.
Either way, it seems. And I would taking a role now, as you say, in many of the conflicts around the world. Are they going to get involved in, or have they advocated with regard to the Ukrainian crisis?
I know they called for. They joined other nations in calling for respect of international law, which would mean respect for the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. I don't know that that there's going to be a direct role for them until there may be some kind of peacekeeping operation, in which case they would certainly be an important.
He is with us, the Global Vatican. Ambassador Rooney, I want to thank you for joining me. I know that you were gracious enough to stay on a little longer than scheduled. I urge people to get the book. It's fascinating. It's great history. Gives great insight in the history of diplomacy and American Catholic relations. Book available, of course, in all major bookstores and at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Sir, I want to thank you for joining me. Any final thoughts?
The penetrating questions and particularly the chance to talk a little bit about the continuing important role the Holy See can play in diplomacy right now, in the world we face now.
Well, again, I want to thank you for joining me, Ambassador Rooney, and let's stay in touch. I'd like to perhaps do a follow-up in the future as issues develop.
It'll be a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so that's Ambassador Francis Rooney. He is former ambassador to the Vatican in the Bush administration. The book is The Global Vatican. This is really, I think, a dynamite read. An inside look at the Catholic Church, world politics, and the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. So check that out. I'm about halfway through it, and in a sense, as I said, the Church has both its greatest strength and at times its weakness in its extraordinary unity and universality. The ship of state right. I think that a lot of the attacks on the Church now are more to do with those who want to change the Church and make the Church fit their particular image, rather than any sort of complaint about existing scandal. And that's my way of thinking, is really a fundamental attack on the institution itself, which I think is what's going on here. So we'll be right back. Since the Roman times, and certainly before that, not a day has gone by where 10 men have not gathered somewhere in the world and prayed together and read from the Torah, which is, of course, the Word of God in the Jewish faith. And that in Judaism we also have learned rabbis, a tradition that was started really around the same time that the Catholic Church got its founding, who would adjudicate the laws of the Torah in a way that was appropriate for the Jewish people and appropriate for the world. And I look to those rabbis to do just that. But my criterion as a Jew, when I look at that, is to ask myself whether or not the rabbis involved are actually drawing from the inspiration and the hard work of millennia of generations of rabbis, number one. And number two, whether or not, and that shouldn't be number two, it's just as important, of course, whether or not they are actually trying to interpret and get to exactly what God wanted. Yeah, I heard an interesting comment recently by a rabbi that I happen to respect with regard to the question of the creation, the book of Genesis, how God created the world, Adam and Eve, the first couple, and the assault that's been under by the secularists, those who have to explain everything in the universe in natural terms. Everything has to be looked at that it can be understood through the human senses. Anything else is not true. That everything has to fit to what the natural world appears to be. And that explanation is actually quite interesting, and it very well might run contrary, I suppose, maybe, to some fundamentalist Protestant understandings. And that is that the Torah, and in this case we're talking about the creation, only reveals a small part of the whole story. In the Torah, God tells us only a part of what happened, and that the rest of it, the bigger picture of it, is a mystery. It can't be known because it is not revealed. So we accept that which is revealed with the understanding that the bigger picture is not revealed. And I think that's a very Judaic way to look at this. It's very profound, actually. And it kind of complements it kind of responds well to the naturalists, the materialists, who believe that anything that's real is only that which you can explain because it's sensate. It can be experienced by one of the senses. And that is that there's a mystery to existence. There is a mystery to what it is that makes us get up in the morning and open our eyes and have millions and millions of complex experiences. It's a mystery. And it's only partially revealed, only slightly revealed. For a Jew and for a Christian, that revelation is in the Bible. And that this may also, again, fly in the face of some fundamentalists, I don't know this, who have to take it absolutely literally and believe that everything in the Torah, there's nothing more. In other words, there's nothing less than what's in the Torah, but there's a lot more than what's in the Torah. And I think that understanding is consistent with both Catholic and Jewish understandings and analysis. And, I mean, again, I just want to mention that I'm about halfway through this book, a little less than halfway through it. And it is really inspiring in that, the church has really carried on some of the traditions that go back to really ancient times in a parallel way to what Judaism has done. I mean, we don't have the same, we're very different, but there are parallels. There is a sense of avocation where there's a mission to be a light unto the nations and to do good work in the world, to try to create a better world through trying to be as close as possible to the code of God and to live that code in a practical sense in our actions. I think that every human being, most human beings, there is an inherent part of us that wants to do good for others. We want to help others as a way of enforcing our own sense of worth. And I just think that that's a basic. It's just in the same way that it's a basic element to a human being to want to be self-sufficient, to want to work. It goes to a basic, sense of who you are and your sense of self-worth. And I think that Catholicism and Judaism also echo this idea that when you accept a construct, in a sense, when you accept a series of rules, kind of the rules of the game, if you will, then you are then free to pursue these things on your own as a sovereign citizen, and that you establish governments as a vehicle to protect that sovereignty, to protect that individual right to determine the nature of your own life and your own future.
Chuck Morse speaks.
It has indeed been an honor for me and a privilege to interview Ambassador Francis Rooney and his new book, which I wish him a great deal of success on. I think it's an important book. It is an easy to read and easy to understand and accessible synopsis of not only the history of the Vatican, the modern history of the Catholic Church, including some of the great personalities that were Pope, but also a history of Catholic diplomacy, of its moral suasion in the world, its position in the world, the significance of that. These are inspiring stories. It's also inspiring to see how the Church did survive for these many thousands of years, and how it has dealt with very, very serious threats to its sovereignty, including, of course, Nazi tanks rolling up outside of the St. Peter's Basilica, and on the verge of taking them away and taking the Pope away and arresting him. Hitler didn't do that. Probably was afraid that there'd be a rebellion, and that mainly is because of this position the Catholic Church, of respect that the Catholic Church has, and how that agenda has been furthered in our own time with the role of the new Pope Francis. I am very pleased to see, as mentioned, the canonization of both John Paul II and John the 23rd, both of whom were great churchmen. I actually also like Pope Paul, but I don't know if he's up for a canonization. But I am particularly heartened by the canonization of John Paul II because I think that he played a pivotal role in the collapse of international communism. Is communism back with Putin? I don't think so. I mean, I think that Putin is not as far to the left as was Stalin and Khrushchev and the rest of them, nor is he as far to the left as Hitler was. But we nevertheless have to watch him with great concern and trepidation. Anyway, I shall return.